Have you ever had someone look you in the eyes at your own family's Thanksgiving table and tell you that everything you'd built every late night, every sacrificed weekend, every promotion you clawed for meant absolutely nothing without their last name attached to it? That's exactly what my uncle did to me 11 days ago, in front of 43 relatives, my grandmother included. He told me I was replaceable, that I should be grateful he'd even allowed me a seat at the table his brother my father had built. So I stood up, set my company laptop on the table, and told him to keep it. What he didn't know was that I'd already copied every file that mattered. What he really didn't know was that my father had been watching him for years before the cancer took him, and he'd left me everything I needed to prove it. 48 hours later, my uncle's $150 million deal collapsed, his business partner walked, and 2 federal investigators showed up at his front door. My name is Claire, and this is the story of how I dismantled a fraud built on my father's legacy, using the exact tools my father taught me to use. Hargrove Construction had been in our family for 31 years. My father started it with a crew of 4, a second-hand excavator, and a reputation for showing up on time and finishing what he started. By the time I was old enough to understand what he did for a living, the company had grown into a mid-sized commercial builder with contracts across the Southeast, 200 employees, and a name that meant something in the industry. My father was not a flashy man. He drove a Ford F-150 with 140,000 miles on it and wore the same 3 dress shirts on rotation for board meetings. What he was, though, was meticulous. He documented everything. Every contract, every variance, every handshake deal that later turned into a paper trail. He told me once that the most dangerous thing in business wasn't a bad economy or a difficult client. It was a partner who thought they'd never be caught. I didn't understand what he meant until after he was gone. He passed when I was 26. Pancreatic cancer, which does not negotiate and does not give you enough time to say everything that needs to be said. What he did leave me was a letter, filed with his estate attorney, to be opened on the 1-year anniversary of his death. I'll come back to that letter. For now, what's important to understand is what happened to Hargrove Construction after my father died. His younger brother, my uncle, had joined the company 12 years earlier, after his own landscaping business quietly failed. My father gave him a position in business development, which sounds impressive, until you understand that my uncle's actual contribution was playing golf with potential clients and showing up to ribbon-cutting ceremonies. The relationship worked because my father ran everything that actually mattered, and my uncle stayed out of his way. They had a gentleman's agreement, unwritten, which was the single biggest mistake my father ever made. When my father died, my uncle became managing director by default. The board, mostly older men who'd known my father and felt obligated to keep things in the family, allowed it. They assumed the company would run itself on the infrastructure my father had spent 3 decades building. They assumed my uncle understood the difference between having his name on a door and actually knowing what was behind it. They were wrong on both counts. I had been working at the company since I was 22, starting in the accounting department while finishing my master's in financial management at night. I knew every number in our system. I had been the one running quarterly projections when my father's health started declining. By the time he passed, I was essentially functioning as the chief financial analyst, without the title, without the salary that should have come with it, and without a single vote on anything that happened above my pay grade. That last part was my uncle's doing. He restructured the leadership team 4 months after my father's death, and pointedly excluded me from the new organizational chart. When I asked why, he said he wanted fresh perspectives, and that it wasn't personal. He gave my effective responsibilities to a man named Derek, who had been at the company for 8 months, and whose most notable qualification was that he'd gone to school with my uncle's son. I went back to my office, opened a spreadsheet, and kept working. That was my answer to most things in those early years: just keep working, keep documenting, keep being so undeniably competent that eventually the numbers would speak for themselves. What I didn't understand yet was that when someone has already decided you don't belong at the table, your competence becomes threatening rather than valuable. For 3 years, I watched Derek present my analysis in leadership meetings, while my uncle nodded approvingly. I watched contracts get awarded to vendors my uncle had personal relationships with, at rates that made no financial sense. I flagged a $2.3 million discrepancy in a subcontractor payment. A vendor my uncle had brought in personally, and was told by Derek, relaying my uncle's message, that I was being too granular and that I should focus on my assigned scope. The discrepancy quietly disappeared from the records I had access to. I made a copy of it before it did. I need to explain something about my family's Thanksgiving tradition, because the context matters. For 20 years, my grandmother has hosted Thanksgiving at her house in Savannah, the same house my grandfather built himself. The same long oak table that seats 22, the same sweet potato casserole recipe that my grandmother has made from memory since 1987. After my father died, it became the one gathering where I still felt connected to something real. Even when my uncle's side of the family dominated the conversation, even when the toasts were all about my uncle's vision and my uncle's leadership and the new direction of Hargrove construction, I still came. My grandmother was there. That was enough. This past Thanksgiving was different. My uncle had news to share. He'd been quietly negotiating a joint venture for months, a $150 million mixed-use development project with an Atlanta-based investment group called Meridian Partners. It was the largest deal in the company's history. He'd kept the details internal, which meant he hadn't consulted me, despite the fact that I was the most qualified person in the building to evaluate the financial structure of a deal that size. The first I heard about it in any real detail was when he stood up at my grandmother's table, glass of Bordeaux in hand, and announced it to the entire family. He spoke for several minutes about growth and legacy, and honoring what my father had started. My cousin recorded on his phone. My grandmother beamed. And then my uncle turned to me specifically, in front of everyone, and said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. He said that he knew some people in the company had struggled with the new direction. That change was hard for people who were used to doing things a certain small way. That my father had been a wonderful man, but he'd built something modest, and it was time for Hargrove to think bigger. He looked at me when he said the word modest. He looked at me when he said small way. And then he said directly, "Claire has always been most comfortable with the details. Numbers, girl. Nothing wrong with that. But this deal requires the kind of relationships and vision that," and he paused here, "just slightly not everyone develops." My cousin stopped recording. He looked at his plate. Two of my aunts shifted in their seats. My grandmother's expression changed in a way I'd never seen before. Something careful and deliberate crossing her face before she went neutral again. I picked up my company laptop from the bag at my feet. I placed it on the table in front of my uncle. I told him he was right. I told him that I'd clearly reached the ceiling of what I could contribute at Hargrove, and that I wouldn't waste either of our time pretending otherwise. I told him I'd have my badge and my parking pass on Derek's desk by morning. And I told him, calmly, without a single crack in my voice, that I hoped the Meridian deal was everything he'd promised it would be. My grandmother caught my eye as I stood. She gave me the smallest nod. I understood it immediately. "Go. Do what you need to do. I've been waiting for this." I drove to my apartment, brewed coffee, and opened my personal laptop, a MacBook I'd bought myself, never connected to a company server. I had been quietly building a secondary archive for 14 months. Every anomaly I'd flagged and been dismissed about. Every vendor irregularity. The $2.3 million subcontractor discrepancy that had disappeared. 3 other irregularities totaling just over $8 million across the past 2 years, all routed through the same cluster of shell entities. I documented them carefully, dated, sourced, cross-referenced against the original records before they were altered. Then I remembered my father's letter. I'd read it once on the day I was supposed to the 1-year anniversary of his death, and then I'd put it in a fireproof box and let myself grieve what it said, rather than act on it immediately. In the letter, my father told me he'd been watching his brother for years, that he'd suspected irregularities going back almost a decade, and had been too loyal, too cautious, too willing to give family the benefit of the doubt to act on what he'd seen. He told me he was sorry he hadn't protected the company better. And he told me that everything he'd documented, every irregularity he'd quietly compiled, was in a sealed folder, in the care of his attorney, Eleanor Voss, who had instructions to provide it to me at my request, but only after I had left the company or been pushed out, because he knew I would stay as long as I had any reason to stay, and he needed me to be outside the building before I used what he'd found. My father, who drove a Ford F-150 with 140,000 miles on it, had built me a case from beyond the grave. I called Eleanor Voss at 8:30 that same night. She answered on the second ring. She told me she'd been expecting my call and that she was sorry it had taken this long for me to have reason to make it. She told me the folder was substantial, and that she'd retained a forensic accountant to review it before my father died, because he'd wanted a professional assessment. She read me the summary figure. My father had documented $23 million in fraudulent billing schemes, inflated vendor contracts, and undisclosed related party transactions over a span of 6 years. She told me it was almost certainly more now. She told me to come to her office first thing in the morning and to bring everything I had. I didn't sleep. I spent the night organizing my own documentation alongside the summary Eleanor had described, building a timeline that connected my father's earlier findings to the patterns I'd identified in the years since. By 4 in the morning, I had a complete picture. My uncle hadn't just been skimming. He'd been systematically looting a company my father had built from nothing, hiding the transfers inside legitimate project budgets where they'd be difficult to detect unless you already knew what to look for. I also found something new. Something I hadn't been looking for. The Meridian deal, the $150 million joint venture my uncle had just announced at Thanksgiving dinner, was structured in a way that made no financial sense, unless you knew that Meridian Partners had a silent investor, whose identity wasn't disclosed in any of the documents I'd seen. I ran the entity name through a state business registry. The silent investor behind one of Meridian's funding entities was a holding company registered in Delaware. The registered agent for that holding company was a man named Gerald Briscoe. Gerald Briscoe was my uncle's college roommate, his personal attorney for the past 20 years, and the man my uncle had quietly paid $340,000 in consulting fees through a Hargrove vendor account over the past 3 years, with no documentation of any services rendered. The Meridian deal wasn't a business opportunity. It was an exit strategy. My uncle was planning to use Hargrove's assets to fund a deal that would pay him and his associate on both sides of the table. Eleanor examined every piece of it the next morning. She brought in 2 colleagues. By noon, she had called a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, someone she'd worked with on a previous case, and by 3 o'clock, 2 investigators had reviewed the preliminary documentation and confirmed they had sufficient basis to open a formal inquiry. Eleanor then called the chairman of Hargrove's board, a man named Philip Garrett, who had known my father for 25 years and who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with my uncle's management style for at least 18 months, though he'd lacked any concrete reason to act. She told him there would be an emergency board meeting the following morning. She told him what it was about. She told him he should have his own counsel present. That evening, my uncle sent me a text message. 2 sentences. He said he hoped I'd slept on things and come to my senses, and that if I showed up Monday morning to apologize, he'd let me come back in my original role. He didn't understand yet that I wasn't gone. I'd just changed rooms. The Hargrove board met at 9 the next morning in a conference room that still had my father's name on a plaque by the door. 7 board members. Eleanor and her team on one side of the table. My uncle arrived with Derek and a look of controlled confidence, the look of a man who assumed he was walking into a formality. He saw me and stopped. He looked at Eleanor. He looked back at me. And for just a second, the confidence moved. Eleanor did not waste time. She placed a document binder in front of each board member. She outlined the fraud in precise sequential order, beginning with the earliest irregularity my father had documented and running forward to the Meridian deal structure she'd unpacked the previous day. She presented the forensic accountant's findings. She presented the entity analysis on the Meridian silent investor. She played a voice recording which I had not known my father had made of my uncle telling a vendor, in explicit terms, that his invoices needed to be padded by 15% and that the difference would be wired to a separate account within 30 days of payment. The recording was from 4 years ago. The board member who had been most consistently supportive of my uncle physically leaned away from the table as it played. My uncle tried twice to interrupt. Eleanor stopped him both times with the same calm, practiced delivery. She told him he was welcome to speak when she had finished presenting the documentation, and that anything he said in this room would likely be relevant to the federal inquiry that had been opened the previous afternoon. After that, he didn't speak at all. Philip Garrett, who had known my father since the company was 3 years old and a crew of 4, looked at my uncle for a long time before he said anything. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely level. He said that he had respected my uncle out of loyalty to my father's memory, and that he believed my uncle had just spent 6 years stealing from that memory. He said he was calling a vote immediately. He did not ask my uncle to leave the room, which I thought was deliberate. He wanted my uncle to sit there and watch it happen. The vote to remove my uncle as managing director was 7-0. He abstained, and the board told him his abstention would be noted in the minutes but changed nothing. The vote to freeze all pending transactions, including the Meridian joint venture, was also unanimous. Eleanor had already sent formal notice to Meridian Partners that morning. Their CEO had responded within the hour, expressing surprise and requesting clarification on the investment structure, which suggested he may not have been fully aware of the side arrangement Gerald Briscoe had engineered. Meridian's own legal team would spend the following week untangling what their silent investor had been doing. That was their problem to sort out. Philip turned to me. He said that the board wanted to discuss the path forward for the company, and that they wanted me in the room for that conversation. He said that what I'd done, and what my father had prepared, represented exactly the kind of integrity that Hargrove was supposed to be built on. He said he was sorry that it had taken this long for anyone at that table to say it out loud. I told him I appreciated that. I told him I wasn't interested in taking my uncle's title or stepping into a role that had been defined around someone else's failures. What I wanted was a properly structured position with real authority, independent financial oversight that didn't run through a single managing director, and a governance review of every contract my uncle had approved in the past 3 years. I told him I would do the work, but I was done doing it without the standing to match. He said those terms sounded like a good starting point. My uncle left the building that morning with Derek, and without saying a word to me. He did not look at my father's name on the plaque by the door on his way out. His company car, a black Escalade, the company leased for him, stayed in the parking garage. He'd come in a rideshare. I only learned that later, from the front desk, and I thought it said something about what he'd expected from that meeting he'd known, somewhere, that the car might not be leaving with him. The legal consequences moved faster than I expected. The federal investigators had been building on similar patterns in a parallel case, and my father's documentation, combined with the voice recording and the Meridian entity analysis, gave them enough to move quickly. By the end of the week, my uncle and Gerald Briscoe had both been formally contacted by federal investigators. The fraud totaled, once the full audit was completed, just under $31 million over 8 years. Wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, tax evasion on the undisclosed distributions. My uncle hired a defense attorney. Gerald Briscoe, apparently, cooperated almost immediately. Derek resigned before anyone asked him to. He sent me a 2-line email that was more confused than apologetic. I wished him well, and meant it Derek had been used by someone more experienced at using people, and that was a different kind of problem than what my uncle had done. My grandmother called me the evening of the board meeting. She told me she had known something was wrong for years and had been waiting for me to come to her. I told her I wished she'd said something sooner. She told me, quietly, that she'd known better than to come to me, that I would have stayed and tried to fix it from the inside, and I would have been destroyed in the process. She said she'd been waiting for my uncle to push me out himself, because that was the only way I would have ever let go of what I thought I owed to my father's memory. She said my father would have told me the same thing, and I thought about his letter and the condition he'd attached to it, and I realized she was probably right. My mother called the next day. She said she was proud of me, and then she said she was also worried. And could any of this be handled a little more quietly? I told her it couldn't. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that my father always said the truth was expensive, but the alternative was worse. I told her I'd take that as her blessing. She laughed a little, which was all I'd needed. My cousin, the one who'd been recording at Thanksgiving, texted me a meme of a chess piece with the word checkmate and nothing else. I sent back a thumbs up. It was the most accurate summary anyone gave me all week. 4 months later, Hargrove Construction closed its first major project under the restructured leadership, a municipal contract with Fulton County that my team had been courting for 2 years, before my uncle's Meridian obsession had sidelined everything. The margin was better than anything the company had posted in the previous 3 years. Philip called it a new chapter. I told him it was just the company running the way it was supposed to. I took the managing director title in the end, not because I'd changed my mind about what I wanted, but because the governance reforms I'd put in place made the title mean something different than it had before. There's now an independent financial oversight committee. There's an external audit every 18 months. There's a whistleblower policy that actually protects the people who use it. I pushed for all of it before I accepted anything, because my father had shown me what happened when you trusted a title without the structure to hold it accountable. My uncle pled guilty 8 months after the investigation opened. 14 counts. His sentencing is pending. As of this writing, Gerald Briscoe received a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation. The $31 million in recovered assets was partially reintegrated into the company's operating capital and partially directed toward a repair fund for the vendors who had been shorted during the scheme subcontractors, end quote. Suppliers, mostly small businesses, who had filed complaints over the years that had quietly gone nowhere. That part mattered to me. Those were people who had built things alongside my father's company and been cheated afterward. Getting that right wasn't satisfying in the same way the board meeting had been. It was quieter than that. It felt like paying off a debt that wasn't mine, but was still my responsibility to settle. There's a photo on my desk now. It's from a project ribbon cutting from 2009, back when Hargrove was smaller, and my father still did every ribbon cutting himself. He's wearing one of his 3 dress shirts. He looks like he's trying not to smile too wide because he's standing next to a county commissioner, and he doesn't want to seem too eager, but he's failing at it. The smile is there. He looks the way I feel on the days when the company wins something it earned cleanly. No shortcuts, no arrangements, no corners cut. I keep the letter he wrote me in the same fireproof box as before. I've read it maybe 30 times since Thanksgiving. The last line says, "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder while I was there, but I knew you would. That's why I waited." Clients ask me sometimes why I specialize in family business governance. I've started consulting for other companies on the side, cases where founders' children are watching something built with real work slowly hollow out. I tell them it's because I've seen what happens when a business outgrows its accountability structure, and when it does, it's always the people doing the actual work who pay for it first. I tell them the best inheritance anyone can leave you isn't the business itself, it's the documentation that proves it belongs to you. And if you've ever sat at a table where someone with your last name told you that you owed them your future, I want you to know something. You don't. You really don't. What you owe is the work, done honestly, with your name on it. The rest is just someone else's fear wearing a suit. If this story landed somewhere real for you, if you've been the person in that room, doing the work that someone else took credit for, waiting for the moment where the truth becomes louder than the title, leave a comment below. I read everyone. And if you know someone who needs to hear that the foundation doesn't have to stay silent forever, send this to them. Subscribe so you don't miss the stories I share every week about standing your ground when family makes you feel like you shouldn't have one. What would you have done? Would you have used everything your father left you, knowing it would end your uncle's career and change your family forever, or would the weight of that loyalty have kept you quiet? Tell me below. There's no wrong answer. There's only the one you could live with.